Welcome to the lecture on Emergence of Nationalism in India. When we talk about nationalism, it refers to the loyalty of a group towards a common history, culture, religion, region, and so on and so forth. So, nationalism is the desire to achieve political independence, especially by a country under a foreign control, or by a people with a separate distinct identity and culture, but having no state of their own. It refers to a proud loyalty and devotion, excessive or fanatical devotion, as well as to its interests and the belief that one country is superior to the others. If we talk about the factors that were responsible for emergence of Indian nationalism, then there were many and not one. And also it was a process that had continued for several years and in fact several decades. The British exploitation of Indian masses for a century had created hatred and animosity against them. The introduction of Western education was an eye-opener for the Indians towards the colonial rule of the British Raj. Besides, there were several other factors that contributed for the growth of nationalism in India. If we talk about the political and administrative unity, which became a reality under the colonial rule, as a result of one administrative framework, one set of law, judicial court, administrative officers, etc., many changes appeared. It created awareness among Indians that this vast unified India belongs to them, and hence it was the next step, that was creation of a distinct identity. Then further there were many developments that took place, like development in the means of communication and transport. Dalhousie made a lasting contribution for Indians by introducing railways, telegraph, and a new mode of postal system. Roads were connected with India from one end to the other. Though all these were meant to serve the imperial interests, and to gain access to cheaper raw materials, as well as to connect the ports connect the hinterland with the peripheries as well as the core areas. It was largely the people of India who benefited out of this process, this development of transportation and communication. The railway compartment reflected a united India. It narrowed down the gap among people and gave them the feeling that they all belong to this vast territory which was under the grip of the colonial rule. And so therefore gradually this feeling of belongingness, this feeling of connection with each other developed. Then one can also outline the impact of Western education. Introduction of English education in 1835 was a milestone in the British administration. It was mainly responsible to create an educated Indian mass who would be faithful servants to the British Raj. However, with the gradual march of time, one can say that the English educated Indians became the pioneers in the socio-political, economic and religious reforms that were to take place in India. So it is in this context that one can talk about several changes that were rooted in liberal philosophy. So Raja Ram Mohan Roy, Swami Vivekanand, Firoz Shah Mehta, Dadabhai Naoroji, Surendranath Banerjee and many others, they championed the cause of liberty, equality, humanitarianism, etc. And they all had been exposed to the Western liberal thoughts and ideas. Gradually what we see is that several English educated Indians became the torch bearers of a national identity, and they aroused national consciousness in the minds of millions of Indians directly or indirectly. One can also refer to the changes that came in the form of socio-religious reform movements. So the national awakening in the 19th century was largely due to the socio-religious movements launched by Raja Ram Mohan Roy, later on Swami Dayanand Saraswati, Swami Vivekanand, Syed Ahmad Khan, Annie Besant, etc. Now these reformers championed the causes of equality, individual liberty, abolition of social disparity, etc. And this greatly reformed also the minds of Indians, and it also incited them to oppose serfdom to which they had been forced to. A very important change that came about was the growth of vernacular literature. The influence of Western education prompted the educated Indians to reflect the idea of liberty, freedom, and nationalism through the vernacular literature, because the masses were still not English educated. So, if an idea had to be conveyed to them, it had to be in their own language. So, therefore, vernacular literature was the only answer to this aim. They aimed at arousing the masses to oppose British rule, being surcharged by the spirit of nationalism. It is in this context that one can give reference to Bankim Chandra Chatterjee's Anand Math, which contained the song Vande Mataram, and Deen Bandhu Mitra's play Neel Darpan, which extorted tremendous influence upon the people and created anti-British feelings among them. Then there was Bhartendu Harish Chandra's play Barag Pardas, which reflected the miserable condition of Indian masses under British rule. However, several eminent poets and writers in different languages, like Rabindranath Tagore in Bengali, Vishnu Shastri Chiplunkar in Marathi, then Baz Barua in Assamese, Muhammad Hussain Azad and Altar Hussain Ali in Urdu, etc., greatly contributed to rouse nationalism among the local people through their writings and speeches. So therefore, we can say that press was playing a very important role in bringing about this change, and newspapers. So press and magazines, they also injected these nationalistic feelings. Raja Ram Mohan Roy was the pioneer of Indian press as well as journalism. He edited Sambad Komedi in Bengali and Miratul Akhbar in Persian. Gradually, several newspapers were edited in different parts of the country in different languages. So, there was the Amrit Bazar Patrika, Hindu Patriot, Indian Mirror, Bengali, Sanjeevani and Saharan in Bengali. Then the Marathi Kesari, Native Opinion, Indu Prakash in Maharashtra, Hindu, Kerala, Patriya, Andhra Pradeshikas in Madras, then the Tribune, then Akhbar-e-Aam, Koh-e-Noor in Punjab. These were some of the important publications that reflected negatively on the impact of colonial rule and also aroused the feeling of nationalism in the minds of masses. Then there was also this attempt that was going on regarding the rediscovery of India's glorious past. So, one can say that while the beginnings had been made by the Orientalist scholars and several Western scholars like Max Miller, William Jones, Alexander Cunningham, etc., had translated several ancient Sanskrit texts and had also this kind of also exposed the people to the glorious cultural heritage of India. Now, inspired by them, several Indian scholars like R.D. Banerjee, R.G. Bhandarkar, Mohan Mukhopadhyay, Har Prasad Astir, Bal Gangadhar Tilak, etc., they also rediscovered India's past glory, and this greatly encouraged people of India who felt that they were the ancestors of a grand civilization, and now this grand civilization was wrongly being ruled by the foreigners. So this also greatly flared up the fire of nationalism. However, ultimately this also proved to be a discontent among the minority community, as their culture or their civilization was not given adequate representation in this kind of narrative. So therefore, summing up, we can say that when we are talking about the causes of Indian nationalism, then it is not one but several causes, like discontent meant with the policies of the colonial rule, and then the administrative unification of India, then the kind of leadership that was emerging in India with the spread of Western education, then appearance of a common language, the new print culture, as well as beginning of several nationalist organizations which originally began as regional organizations, as platforms for educated Indians to come together and to discuss the common problems. So, as a result, the next major change that was going to come about was the emergence of political nationalism, that is, the desire for political freedom, demand for voting rights, and demand for increasing the element of Indians in government, and finally the demand for independence. Then one can also talk about cultural nationalism, which basically means development of a distinct Indian cultural identity with the emphasis on past glory, achievements in several fields, and then also an attempt to rewrite histories to challenge the colonial bias. So we can say that nationalism in India began as a result of several processes from the late 19th century. Indians did not like being under colonial rule because not only because they were being discriminated against, they were not getting the best of jobs, they were not getting the best of education, and the Indian craftsmen were not being allowed to run traditional businesses because this way they would compete with the British businesses. So there were a host of economic causes also. It is in this background that we can refer to the important role played by Ram Mohan Roy, and how the liberal ideas kind of were discussed by him, and he tried to combine the Western and Indian ideas. Because of his influence, he is also hailed as one of the pioneer of this kind of identity formation. This is the famous statue of Raja Ram Mohan Roy that stands outside the Bristol Cathedral. The nationalist movement did not begin unless and until Indians considered themselves as being equal to the rest. So this idea was expressed greatly by the reformer Ram Mohan Roy in 1820s, and he felt and he also conveyed that the Britishers were violating Indians' rights, including the right to free speech as well as religion. So therefore it was this very realization and his ability to speak out in these terms that the process started. He wrote texts, he opened schools to kind of spread these ideas, and however, though the process had started in 1820s, but it took several decades, and it was not before 1885 that the first nationalist organization, that is the Indian National Congress, came to be established by English speaking Indians. So it was in 1800s that Ram Mohan Roy led this modernization movement, and also he resented and questioned the fact that why citizens, Indian citizens, were being reduced to second class citizens in their own country. And he also countered the criticisms that had been levelled by British missionaries on Indian customs, Hinduism, culture, etc. He finally founded the Brahmo Samaj in 1828 as a new religion with Christian style services. He also encouraged Indians to be egalitarian, to move away from the rigidities of the caste system, and to accept that all people are equal irrespective of their caste. And he was very much interested in serving the needs of the poor. And he was also opposed to child marriages as well as widow suicides. He believed that these practices needed to be changed if India had to be free from exploitation by the outsiders. Then another very important reason that we can discuss with the reference to emergence of nationalism was racism. So in this slide that is being shown to you, it is just one example of how racist the colonial masters were and how they considered the rest as below dignity. While we are talking about the emergence of nationalism, it also needs to be kept in mind that who were these first Indian nationalists? They were not part of the masses. They were invariably belonging to upper class. They were English educated. Many of them belonged to the urban areas like Bombay, Madras, Calcutta. Most of them had been trained in British law, and some were members of the civil services, and most of them preferred reform to revolution. So that is why the first phase of Indian National Congress is considered as the moderate phase. And the new Indian middle classes slowly grew tired of the injustices of the British rule. So the new nationalists, they wrote in both English as well as their regional languages, and they also turned to several aspects of Indian tradition, especially Hinduism, as a rallying ground for national pride. However, this also resulted in a problem, that was ignoring or overlooking the needs and requirements of other community, resulting in their polarization. Now, during the years of British rule, a class of Western educated Indians had emerged who dreamt of ending imperial rule. So it is in this background we can say that the colonial legacy as far as English education also can be considered. So the changes that had been introduced by Macaulay with the aim to raise a class of Indians who would be forever loyal to the colonial rule did not function that way. And in fact, this very class of persons who would be Indian in blood and color, soon they started opposing British rule. Then there was also a very important change that was coming about again from 1870s onwards, and that was the desire to preserve Indian culture. So there were several teachers, writers and journalists who wanted to pay attention to this sphere. In the early 1800s, when the British had established a college in Calcutta, a publishing house was opened too. It published Western books, but also books on India's ancient language of Sanskrit and dictionaries, several grammar books for many of Indian languages. This spread to other regions of India also and resulted in writers searching for Indian identity in modern novels as well as poetry. So Indians began writing historical romances, epics, and usually in their own regional language. Here one can also give an example of the role played by Rabindranath Tagore in preserving and projecting Indian culture as great. He was not only a social reformer or a spiritual leader, but also an educator, a philosopher, an international spokesperson on morality. His life's mission was to promote pride in Indian culture in the face of British domination. He wrote a widely popular novel in which he portrayed the love-hate relationship of Indians towards British, reflected how Indian people had struggled with defining their identity as they were also trying to admire and imitate the British, but in the process were losing some of their Indian traditions. He basically wanted peace and a union of the East and West. Tagore also strove to have a balance between the Western influence as well as ancient customs. He was respected as well as followed by both the British colonizers and Indians for his work. However, he preferred to stay out of politics, though he was a friend of Gandhi. One of his very important statements was, "It is my conviction that my countrymen will truly gain their India by fighting against the education that teaches them that a country is greater than the ideals of humanity." So this sums up how important for Tagore was the belief in humanity and human values. Another very example of an attempt to preserve Indian culture was the role played by nationalist newspapers that were published in several regional languages. These newspapers reached the lower middle class, tens of thousands of Indians who did not know English. So therefore, their influence was definitely more, and in this context we can give example of newspapers like Kesari or the Lion newspaper, then in which Tilak conveyed negative feelings about the British without writing anything directly disloyal. Then there was Swadesh Mitram, in which the editor organized literary meetings to discuss poetry along with politics. A very important part was played by several controversies also, and it is in this context that one can talk about the infamous Ilbert Bill controversy. During the period of Ripon as Viceroy, the Ilbert Bill was passed, which empowered the Indian judges to try the Europeans. Now, as this bill was passed, there was a complete backlash from the white population, as they considered it beyond their dignity to be tried by Indian judges. It created much hue and cry among the Europeans, and their pressure ultimately led to reform the bill, inserting a clause that an Indian would try a European in the presence of a European witness. So, what was the result of this? This clearly exposed the malified intention of the British authority and clearly projected their racial antagonism. And this played a very important role as an eye-opener, especially for the educated Indians who kind of realized that under the colonial rule they would never be considered as equal, even if they were professionally of the same rank, even if they were educated, and even if they were broad-minded. Now this realization definitely created a chain reaction, and the result was the formation of organizations of educated Indians who started demanding rights of representation. And here we can now speak about the birth of Indian National Congress. Thank you.